Thanks, Kyle. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I am Mary Claire Mulligan, co-chair of the criminal law section of the Boulder County Bar, along with TJ Willard. TJ and I are both criminal defense lawyers and have been for many years. We're really lucky today to be able to present not just ethics credits, but ethics credits that are good for you and won't bore you to tears. Luckily, we have Amy Kingery here with us from COLAP, the Colorado Lawyers Assistance Program, and she's going to be talking about stress and who hasn't been swimming in stress in the last 9 months. All of us have been. Amy is a licensed clinical social worker. She's been with COLAP for the last year, and before that, she spent a number of years working with the state problem-solving courts. And she's got a background in working with children in child welfare and child trauma treatment programs. She's worked with child victims in investigation of child sex crimes. She's been a victim advocate for children involved in sex crimes. She's worked with developmentally disabled adults in specialized programs and has really an all-around kind of, I guess I would say, really well-rounded background, and is really someone that we all want to have on board during the pandemic. I know at this point, I would love my own personal licensed clinical social worker to guide me through the dark days of December pandemic, where I'm not only do I have mask face, but now I have hat head since I haven't gotten my hair cut or colored in 9 months. So as Kyle said, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box and Amy will get to them at the end. And please make sure you're muted. I'm sure everybody knows this by now. We can all hopefully see Amy's PowerPoint. If you have any technical questions, please feel free to reach out to Kyle. If anything comes up and you can't reach Kyle for some reason, just post it in the chat and I will keep an eye on it and make sure that I can get a hold of Kyle for you if there's any issue. And now, without any further ado, I will turn it over to Amy Kingery. Thank you so much for coming today, Amy.
Thank you, Mary Claire and Kyle. I appreciate you both having me and supporting me through this project today. And just want to start by thanking everyone for attending this presentation as well. In addition to the lure of the ethics credits, I do recognize that when we are undergoing these extreme periods of unpredictability, extreme stress and change, that oftentimes it's our focus on ourselves and that forward learning and thinking that go out the window first. And that's normal, that's human nature. We'll talk a little bit about why that is the case, but just wanted to first acknowledge that you made it. For some of you, it sounds like this might be your last day working before you get a brief break for the holidays. So congratulations, you're there, almost there. And just take a nice deep breath to reset and then we'll dive in. For those of you who aren't familiar or want a quick refresher, COLAP, we're supported under the Colorado Supreme Court, but we do operate confidentially and independently from the Supreme Court and the Office of Attorney Regulation. And what that means is that we have enhanced levels of confidentiality to protect the Colorado legal community that we work with. Our staff are licensed clinicians and legal professionals in the state of Colorado. So in addition to federal HIPAA regulations for confidentiality, we have Supreme Court Rule 254 that adds in that added layer that nothing that anyone calls and shares with us can be we're actually barred from reporting back for any disciplinary proceeding. Likewise, we cannot be subpoenaed for any civil or criminal case. So what that offers the legal community is that protection that you can call for any reason, whether you're concerned about something going on with a colleague, a friend, a family member, or you yourself either are wanting to maybe preemptively set up for self-care and healing in 2021, or you've been struggling perhaps with a mental health diagnosis, maybe some pre-existing anxiety, depression, or something that has bubbled to the surface over the past 9 months, to those maybe struggling either that are in recovery and perhaps struggling right now, or that are getting to the point where you're considering, maybe I might want to consider leading a sober lifestyle. I'm not sure, on the fence a little bit. Our staff can support you with, again, free confidential well-being consultations and really drill down to what's going on and offer some tailored advice and referrals for whatever it is you're going through. Things that our office do not provide simply because we don't have the bandwidth to do so. We don't offer legal advice and we don't offer ongoing counseling, but again, we can share a little bit of tailored insight into what might be going on with your unique scenarios, take a lot of the information like I will share today and tailor it again to your unique scenarios and hopefully get you linked in with appropriate resources. Likewise, we offer a whole host of free ethics CLEs, similar to this one, that you're welcome to be in touch with us about bringing back for a future event for this group or for your own private firms or colleagues that you work with on a day-to-day basis. You'll see our contact information on this screen, and then I'll share that again at the end. And with that, I'll dive on in, and we're going to get started today looking at a overly simplistic, high-level overview of the neuroscience between our brains in a positive stress state versus our brains in a negative or chronic distress state. We'll talk about how that shows up in our mood, our emotion, our mental health, and how that shows up physiologically for us. We'll talk a little bit about unique ways that these stressors may show up for the attorney population, particularly those operating in criminal defense capacity, a little bit about the secondary trauma that might come into play, particularly with the work that you all are doing. And then my favorite part, we'll spend the second half of our time together today looking into this. So what do we do with it? We'll hear a little bit about the doom and gloom and what's at stake if we don't find ways to build in that resiliency. But then we'll really get to the hopeful part, the proven research-based strategies that do assist us in building greater resiliency despite the hardships that you're seeing in your day-to-day personal lives and the world around us right now, and due to the work hazards that you're facing every day because of that increased exposure to the hurt and suffering of others and the toll that that can take on us. So again, diving into that high level brain science overview, we have what's called a triune brain. So it has 3 parts, and many of you are likely familiar and have heard, especially in the work that you do with your clients, heard of that fight or flight response. So if we're talking about a fight or flight response, that's going to be housed down at the base of our brains. If you can see my hand, or you can see the slide or the picture on the right-hand side there, our reptilian part of our brain, or our brainstem, is going to be at the base of our hand. And I'll refer back to this. Dan Siegel likes to use this as handy model of the brain, but I think it's a great way to refer back to as we move through the slides. So we're thinking of our reptilian brain, that's our instinctual part of our brain. It's those fight, flight, freeze, or faint responses. It's where a lot of our anger and fear-based emotions are housed and express themselves right here at our brainstem. And then here in the middle, if I were to fold my thumb in, this is going to be our limbic system. So this is where the full range of our human emotions are housed. It's the yellow section there on the picture on the left-hand side. And what's particularly important for the attorney population is that our learning and our memories are tied intrinsically to our emotions. We have emotional relationships with all of the memories, all the learning that we build in-house. So for example, if you can think back to your time in law school, if you had a particularly stressful, say, course on contracts, and you had a particularly scary or brutal professor that led that course, and that had maybe some negative emotional responses for you after the fact. If you didn't find a new way to relate to contracts separate from that course, if you didn't find new emotional relationships or responses to tie to that content, then you would have likely had a harder time when it came to take the bar exam to effectively recall and regurgitate that information on contracts for the purpose of your bar exam, because it would be tied to those negative emotional connotations from that class with that scary or brutal professor. Not to pick on college professors at all, but that's just one example of how these two things are tied together for ourselves and also for the clients that we're working with. And then if I were to fold my fingers down over the top of my thumb, over the top of that limbic system, building on the reptilian part of our brain, then this whole top oversimplistically consists of our neocortex and our frontal lobe. So you can think of this for our purposes today as the executive functioning parts of our brain. This is where our logic, our speech, our rational thought are all housed. So this is our ability to pull together the environmental cues that are all around us, our learning and emotional responses, and to process all that environmental stimuli coming in a logical and reasonable way, and then respond with all those systems online. What happens when we are in a distressed state? So that stress has become chronic, it's not working for us anymore, and that's in contrast to a good stress or eustress state, eustress, where that stress is that motivation to get us moving. It's that motivation when we have a big trial coming up that gets us moving forward for that. If you're like me, some people might call me a procrastinator. I prefer the term deadline prompted. That's what gets me going and firing on all cylinders to research and produce an end product. That stress is working for us. That's our eustress state, and that's okay. And when we're in a eustress state, you can think about it as having a beginning, a middle, and an end, very similar to a bell curve. So you have that environmental stimuli that comes in, prompts us to do what we need to do. The motivation kicks in, the adrenaline kicks in, the endorphins kick in, we go to court, you go run that race, whatever it may be. And then you hit that peak, and then all those chemicals start to burn off. You finish what you're doing. You go back to that resting state. Maybe you're able to, through very basic movement back in the old days when we had trials fully on board, as an example, to then get back to your office and maybe debrief with a colleague, whether in the courthouse still or in your office, and burn off the rest of those chemicals in our bodies. When we are in a distressed state, or that chronic stress or unpredictability seeps in and takes hold, then we're not able to hit that peak and come back down to a resting state. Instead, we stay at this elevated response rate where we're not able to burn off those excess chemicals. We're not able to rest and repair. And that's where things really become dangerous. And we'll talk a little bit in a moment how things shifting with the pandemic and work from home, things like trials not happening, how that has impacted us too in ways that we can kind of tweak our responses or our environment to still meet those needs. But for now, when we are in that distress state, what we want to remember is that our body is responding to danger, whether it's real or perceived, whether there's actually a saber-toothed tiger in front of us that we have to fight off or run away from, or it's that email that we bring in that just hits at us at a real visceral emotional level and we want to fire off that snarky response to. Our brains are perceiving danger. When we're in that distress state, we're not able to, we're down here in the reptilian part of our brain, so we don't have that logical thought and reasoning online. And we're instead firing off regardless of what's really happening, as if that danger was real. And again, that leads to that fight or flight response. It's addictive, it's self-perpetuating. When one thing has worked in the past, it's even easier to slip into that autopilot. If you are in a room, whether virtual or in person, and others are in that heightened response state or at risk of being in that heightened reptilian state, instinctual state, then that can be self-perpetuating as well. You may have heard of reference to pheromones in the past. Generally in just pop culture, when we hear about pheromones, it's usually tied to intimacy or attraction, but there's a whole host of pheromones that our body gives off, and those can be fear-based or anger-based pheromones as well. So literally, if you are in a room and others are in that heightened state, that can be addictive and contagious to others around you. And we know that when we are in that instinctual part of our brain, and our limbic system to a degree and our executive functioning to a large degree are offline, then we're not stopping to figure out positive emotions. We're not stopping to think about the positive intent behind the sender of that email in that example. And we're instead overanalyzing for the negative. We are looking for threats, literally for human survival, and how we might respond from that threat-based perspective. Now, attorneys in particular are at an increased risk for falling into this response naturally, because you were primed and trained to think this way through your schooling. An attorney brain is trained by nature of the work that you're doing to analyze all aspects of a case in much the same fashion. You are looking for threats to your case, threats to your position, analyzing for weaknesses in the opposing counsel's case, that sort of thing. And that works if you're in that eustress state. And again, you're able to have an end to that and get back to the resting state. But it also predisposes us in the legal field to operating consistently at that distressed space. So what does this look like? I've shared a couple examples already, but again, we know that a lot of this stems from how the attorney brain is wired and how you perceive yourself and others in society view. And largely you are being viewed as the superhero. You are the one that others are turning to for answers when things seem answerless or hopeless. You are the one that is supposed to solve others' problems. You're operating in an adversarial system where there likely can only be one victor arising above another. And particularly in the case of criminal defense, you're working with some of the most extreme forms of hurt and suffering of the human experience. You are not working with folks, as you already know, because things are going well in their lives. And there is often a whole host of very sad stories of suffering, hurt, and hardship that have led your clients to where they are today and why they're working with you. In addition to the facts of the case and the evidence for the prosecution that you're also exposed to throughout this process. You're also wearing all the other hats in life. If you have little ones at home, part-time, full-time, who knows, week to week, that you're homeschooling, supporting, figuring out the holidays from that unique situation and scenario that we find ourselves in right now, and who knows what other hats that are being simultaneously juggled. And we know that this can lead to being in a space, again, where we're predisposed to not be able to get back to that resting state where we let those loads off of our shoulders and recuperate so we can get going again and fire fresh each week. Modern literature has referred to this lately as the Sunday scaries, but it's that phenomenon where you're constantly operating on peak. And this is particularly important to be aware of for those of you that are about to take off some time for the holidays, which I absolutely applaud you for doing. And we'll talk about why that's so important. But we know that you also run the risk, and many of you have likely felt this, where the night comes, the evening comes, the weekends come, those times off come, and you're not ever able to decompress. You're lying in bed at night, Sunday scaries, unable to sleep, and your brain is perseverating over what did or didn't go right last week, what you should have said instead of what you did say related to a particular case. Maybe you have heartburn about a meeting with a client that you're really not looking forward to. And at the end of the day, morning has come and you haven't really gotten that rest and recuperation that we need. And this feeds in again to that vicious perpetual cycle, because night is the best time for us to recuperate from that fight or flight state back into that fully integrated state. It is the best time where our eyes are closed, our senses are shut down to a large degree, and we're not scanning our environments for threats. We are able to rest and recuperate. And we also know, hang in there with me. I know these, like I said, we're going to get into some of the heavy hardships of the field right now, but we're going to bounce back with a lot of hope and stuff that you can apply short term and in the long term to get past this. So hang in here with me for a couple more slides here. But we also know that, again, because of the work you're doing, particularly as criminal defense attorneys, that there is this heightened layer that is above and beyond that some other areas of law don't necessarily deal with at the same elevated level that you do. And that's that extreme and consistent exposure to the hurt and suffering of others. We know that you'll see the stats up here on the screen on the right-hand side. This was a longitudinal study conducted by SAMHSA looking at jail diversion programs across the nation over a period of initially 5 years. And they found over that time that women had a 96% lifetime prevalence of significant traumatic events, and men in the high 80s. We do believe that sometimes there is an underreporting amongst men for lifetime traumatic experiences. But if we're taking these stats at face value here, it's very obvious to see that more likely than not, when 80 to 90% minimum of your population has past or current histories of significant trauma events, then it's also more likely than not that they are predisposed to fall into that fight or flight response because of those traumas they've experienced and the unpredictability, the chronic stress that our criminal justice and legal system poses for us. So you can think about this similar to if you attended a first aid or CPR class. When you are trained in first aid or CPR, there are certain universal precautions based on the assumption that we don't know what communicable diseases that individual that we're offering aid to may or may not have. So because of that, there's these set protocols in place, tools that are used, research-based and used, that minimize the risk of further harm to you as the individual administering aid, to that person that is receiving aid from you, and then to others in the environment around you. That's the premise of these universal precautions. And when we're working with the criminal justice population, if we start from that baseline perspective of more likely than not, the individuals we're working with have this trauma history, and it's significantly impacting their ability to operate in that executive functioning part of their brains. And it's more likely than not that they are operating from a fight or flight state when they're working with us. Then we can start to pull in those tools that minimize risk of further harm or traumatization to our clients and to ourselves and the entire courthouse system as we're working with our clients. And that comes from a space where we know that when someone has suffered from significant past traumas or the secondary trauma from that exposure the toll takes on us as helping professionals, and even the exposure to extreme forms of hurt and suffering like we're seeing in the world at large right now, that over time, if we're not able to heal, we're not able to get the right supports in place and build up those resiliency factors, then it begins to shape ours and our clients' views of ourselves. Are we worthy? Are we not worthy? Is there some guilt or shame for why we're still here and someone else isn't? It begins to shape our beliefs about the world. Is the world a safe place or not? Is the courthouse a safe place or not? Are professionals I'm working with safe people to share openly with or not? And it begins to shape how we build relationships with the world around us. Do we shut down? Do we isolate? Is the world a scary place? Is the world a safe place? Laura Vanderlipsky, a world-renowned expert in secondary trauma, she talks about how for her and many of the other helping professionals she was working with at the time, it reached a point where she couldn't drive past a playground without thinking about either Amber Alerts or head injuries. And so for us as professionals from a secondary trauma perspective, this runs the risk to our well-being when we get to that space where, because of the work we're doing day in and day out, the graphic evidence and the stories we're exposed to, what is actually a small piece of the pie becomes our entire worldview, and it skews our perceptions of reality to the negative. Those healthy doses of calluses that may have started out like a natural defense, similar to a carpenter who builds them up so that his hands are protected, his or her hands are protected while they're building that cabinetry, then becomes callous in the form of our entire demeanor and how we interact with our world. When it gets to that point, we're not able to selectively numb anymore. We're not able to selectively put up defenses to the hurt and suffering, and then take that hat back off at the end of the day when we go home, for example. And when we get to that point, whether we're numbing through just that callous demeanor, we're numbing with the aid of alcohol or other substances, or in some other way, again, we can't selectively numb anymore. So we're equally numbing out the joy, the happiness, the hobbies that help fulfill us outside of work, the thriving, the ability to feel the warmth from a hug with our child, that gets numbed at the same rate that we're numbing the hardships and the hurt and suffering. And so I would stop here for a moment. We have a couple more slides before we dive into the hopeful, though, so what do we do with it? And I'd really challenge you to think about, as I've talked about this, did this draw any sparks for you in your practice and in your work? For me, I spent a number of years early on in my career working with a family drug court program and my caseload was predominantly very young mothers who had very poor life experiences themselves and their newborn children who were born methamphetamine exposed. And again, this was very early on in my career. I did not have any children of my own. My siblings, my closest friends, nobody from my generation that I interacted with had really started having children of their own yet. So my entire world consumption of children, babies, little ones, which most people would say that babies, infants, puppies, those are things that bring you joy, right? My worldview of babies was led by labels such as failure to thrive, neonatal abstinence syndrome, foster care, all these very negative and hopeless scenarios. And over time, that's where that numbing and that hardship began to develop to the point that I couldn't even experience sadness openly when something bad happened to someone on the news or wherever it was. And it wasn't until the birth of my oldest niece, who she's 9 now, came along that I realized just how skewed my world perception had become. And as she developed in her first couple of years of life, she was so brilliant. She's still so brilliant to this day, but she was soaking stuff up like a sponge. She was hitting and exceeding all these developmental milestones. And I couldn't stop talking about her. I was in awe about her. And finally, my family's like, they got a little sick of it. Even her own mom, my sister, got sick of it. And they're like, she's cool, but she's kind of just a baby. She's doing normal baby stuff. Kind of boring, not that exciting. And that's when the light bulb went off for me about how skewed my world perception had become. Very few infants in this world are born methamphetamine exposed. It's a tiny piece of the pie, but it had become my entire worldview. But the thing that brought that to my attention, my niece, was also my redemption in many ways. By having that regular and consistent relationship with her and that exposure to a child that was thriving, I was able to rebalance my perception. Those calluses began to lighten back up to a more appropriate level. I had to overcome some of the guilt and shame that came along with that process for spoiling my first niece in the way a normal auntie would, but that I was always comparing to, I'm giving her life experiences that some of these other kids I'm working with professionally will never ever get in life. But through that process, that was my healing and getting me back to that more perspective balance. So again, think about where in your professional life or even with the world at large today, you might be at an increased risk because of the exposure, whatever you're inundated with day to day, of having a skewed world view that's not doing you any favors anymore. Those calluses aren't the healthy ones of a carpenter. They're that callous, old, crusty perspective now, and it's prohibiting you from fully enjoying your life and your career and your loved ones. And then we'll relate back to this later in interventions that we can use to get back to that more balanced perspective. All right, and rushing through these last few depressing slides, this is so important that we focus on, not just because the emotional toll it takes on us, but the real research evidence-based perspective of how this impacts our bodies. And we know that the risk we run in that chronic stress state for too long includes moodiness, fatigue, exhaustion, inability to get over a cold as quickly as possible, to more extreme forms of autoimmune disorders and compromised immune systems, heart conditions, bone density issues, that chronic heartburn, acid reflux, gut issues that I mentioned before. And the reason this happens relates back to our brains when they're in that reptilian instinctual fight or flight response. When we are caught and stuck and our brain has that singular focus on survival, then it is conserving all the energy in our bodies for that survival response. And different systems within our body that would normally be functioning at 100% or close to can go offline to varying degrees, if not altogether, because they're not important when we are looking at short-term immediate survival. So systems like our digestive system run the risk of going low-line or offline. Our immune system runs the risk of going low-line or offline, and our reproductive system. And that's important, not just because of what we, again, traditionally think of as our reproductive system, our libido, ability to conceive, but also just our ability to relate with other ones, to build those close relationships, to feel connected and close with those in our personal lives runs a risk of going offline as well. So again, if you're sensing that heartburn before a meeting you're particularly worried about, that could be a red flag from your body saying, hey, you're in a distressed state to the point that my digestive system's literally going low line and you're suffering those impacts of that. Likewise, 90%, upwards of 90% of our immune system is made or broken in our digestive system, in our gut. If we're not able to fully digest all of the nutrients that we're taking in every day, even if you're better than me at eating those salads, if we're not fully absorbing those nutrients, then those nutrients aren't able to support our immune system, and that will run the risk of failing as well. And finally, these are stats from the 2016 study of the American Bar Association in Hazelden, looking at rates of problematic substance use, anxiety, and depression across the attorney population. Again, I want to highlight this was 2016. These are pre-pandemic numbers. We know that these rates have gone up across the entire population nationally and even globally since March hit. But at the time of these studies, this is our baseline here. We know that attorneys run the risk of these negative maladies, coping mechanisms at a much higher rate than the general population. So you'll see here, pre-pandemic numbers, 1 in 3 attorneys self-reported struggling with problematic alcohol use, not even touching on other substances, but 1 in 3 reported that their alcohol use was problematic and would qualify for an alcohol use disorder because of how they were coping with the negative stressors of the field. And we know this is higher for our young attorneys, and it's also higher for our solo practitioners. Now, we're at the end of those negative, scary slides I was talking about. And again, the good news is that we also know here today that our brains are not stuck in that fried egg state on drugs. Like we all heard about sizzling away in the frying pans in those commercials in the 80s and 90s, right? We know that even if harm is done at the neurological level in our brain because of chronic stress state, substance use, trauma, that our brains are also highly resilient organs. And just like if you were to start a new regimen today focused on exercising your biceps, you'd see greater strength in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 3 years. It'd be easier to lift and sustain things from a physical perspective if you engaged in that regular discipline and exercise. Our brain is the same way. If you start to use the strategies we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about here today, and already started talking about with the relationship example I already shared, then you will find it easier in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days to build in those resiliency factors. And it doesn't mean the bad stuff goes away. It doesn't mean that the hardships that you're facing with your clients and you're advocating for on their behalf every day go away. The system doesn't improve overnight. And it doesn't mean that 2021 goes away or 2020 goes away and 2021 is bright and shiny day one, right? But we are able to navigate, we're able to be prepared, realize we're at where we are at an increased risk for that exposure and that negative toll, and to build in the necessary buffers, pat ourselves appropriately with the right armor so that we don't experience those long-term health impacts. And I've already alluded to this, but if you remember nothing else from this presentation, it's that resiliency will be made or broken by the quality of your personal relationships, your safest, closest, most fulfilling relationships. So there are numerous wonderful self-help articles that are out there right now, research on resiliency. It's all over the place, and it's a great time to have that information right at our fingertips because of technology. But because everybody's individual scenarios are so different right now, some of you are isolating alone, some with your family, some with small children, some of you feel alone but trapped in a room full of other people at the same time, some of you may have roommates. Everybody's different, but hopefully this will act as an underlying formula that you can then apply to your unique scenarios. And again, you're welcome to contact us for a follow-up consultation if you want that additional support tailoring this to your specific life scenario. But we're going to look at how we assess and connect with ourselves and with others as that balance. So as my niece, and the example I shared earlier, how do we pull in more things like my niece shared and gave to me so that we're balancing out our world perspectives and it's not a reptilian part of our brain running the show. And one way we can do that, particularly in this time of work from home in the pandemic, is by looking at our routines and rituals. What was working in a pre-pandemic world, and what do we need to focus on to mimic or get back to that state like we were before? And it could be something like paying attention to the environmental stimuli that we do have control over and we're taking in. During that same period of time when I was working with that family drug court program, I also found myself falling into this unintentional habit, really subconscious, where every Thursday afternoon from 12:30 to 6:30, I was in this incredibly long, drawn out docket with numerous cases over and over again, hardships, struggles. I'm expected to be on point to both advocate for my clients and make recommendations to the court and hold them accountable where appropriate. And I found myself, again, it didn't hit me at a conscious level for a few months, but leaving my office, getting into my truck, blasting my loud, angry metal rock music, as I'm driving from the office to the courthouse. I probably grabbed a cupcake or a pastry from the break room on my way out. I'm shoving that in my face because I haven't eaten since breakfast before I even got to work. I'm inhaling that. If I have 3 minutes to spare and the line's not long, I'm making a mad dash through either a coffee drive-through or Taco Bell. I'm shoving that taco in my mouth. I'm blasting my rock music, right? And then I get to the courthouse and I'm all in a frenzy. And finally it hit me that perhaps, even though I love my music, I love tacos, and I love cupcakes and excessive amounts of caffeine, that particular routine I found myself in was not setting me up for optimal empathy and performance when I was then on point for the next 6 hours with my clients and all the professionals that were counting on my expert opinion on those cases. So begrudgingly, I had to reassess the environmental factors that I had control over and start to build in a new soundtrack, really start to gauge, is what I'm taking in adding to or detracting from my own resiliency in this situation? We know throughout history that music has profound influence over human emotions. So think about what media, what TV shows, what news, what music you're taking in right now. It's okay to numb out and Netflix and chill if that's what helps us to decompress, but really looking at, are these things setting you up for success? Are the musical cues you're playing in the morning ones that are going to energize and get you ready for the day, or detract from your ability to focus and be on point and positive influence on others, or whatever it may be for your role? Likewise, nature, we know, and we're certainly at an advantage in Colorado year-round. There are numerous studies showing that nature increases empathy in humans. And empathy, in turn, keeps us in that fully integrated brain state where we have all three parts of our brain online, and protects us from those negative health impacts of chronic stress that I shared on the earlier slides. And this holds true whether we're actually out in nature, whether it's house plants or a window with a view, or even outside of those. I worked in a cubicle in an inner part of an office for a number of years myself. Even pictures of nature, representations of nature up on the walls held true in these studies to those increased empathy levels. So think about what you have control over in your environment for yourself, for your family members, your kids at home and their own resiliency. That crusty, grumpy colleague that you care a lot about, but they seem to be growing even more crusty and grumpy. Maybe share with them a plant. You don't have to tell them why. But this is a very easy way that has shown through brain scans and again, those empathy score tests to increase our resiliency. Transitions. How in a work from home environment are you setting down the workday and picking up your home hat for the evening? This is hard to do with modern technology for attorneys in a pre-pandemic world, and I recognize this, but do you need to make like Mr. Rogers in the morning? Do you need to put on that work uniform even if it's not a three-piece suit anymore, even if it's just you have your work set of hoodies and your home lounge set of hoodies. What is it that about your personal grooming habits that are signaling to your brain and your body that it's go time and I'm getting into work mode? There is emerging research post-pandemic looking at the general work from home workforce that has shown a 20% increase in productivity and work satisfaction for those who reported they did have and maintain a grooming routine and a work uniform routine in the mornings, as opposed to those that rolled into work from home still in their PJs or however they were and have those blurred lines from sleep and morning to work. Likewise, in the evenings, we know that the average American is working 2 to 4 additional hours per night in a work from home environment. So what are ways that you can use those environmental cues that you have control over? Maybe a song that comes on that your Alexa device, as an example. I have no stock in Amazon or Alexa. That cues for your family in the evening. It's time to wrap up and get into evening home mode. Are there family night rituals or routines, or friend night rituals or routines you can enact, like breakfast for dinner Wednesday evenings or pizza and a movie Friday night, that if you commit to, that will be an added boundary into your work week to separate it and help you to take off that hat and decompress? And finally, I've alluded to it, we could spend a whole day talking about it, but if you are struggling with that sleep routine, sleep hygiene is something that you can Google, you can find some simple tips, or there is absolutely no shame in talking to a professional about how you might work either with nutrition or with your sleep patterns right now to get back on track. This is a normal thing that many folks are struggling with right now. And the good news is there are a ton of professionals that do this for a living. They know the research, they know the interventions that work. You do not have to suffer in silence or white knuckle it. We don't want to do that. We want to stay strong. We want to prevent things from getting worse right now. So there is no shame in contacting us, contacting a medical professional to talk through how you might get the support and the routine you need as far as your sleep and nutrition right now. I also included, as a final note, and then we'll start a wrap up and turn to questions, but I included oranges on here as a really quick intervention or a strategy. And that's what we're going to close with, a couple quick interventions or strategy for in the moment as you're moving through those days. And maybe you're a little more aware and you sense that heartburn creeping in, or you sense that overly charged emotional response to an email. And you know now, maybe I'm not stopping to assume positive intent, but I'm still mad. Step away from the email, right? Don't send it. But what are ways that you can really quick and effectively get back into the fully integrated state? Orange is a great one. I love this one. I share it anytime I'm working with courtroom clerks, court reporters on homicide cases, child sex assault cases, where they don't have the luxury of showing any emotion on their faces or to step aside when they hear something disturbing. If you can have, where's mine? I have it right out here. Your essential oils that are part of your routine right there, or you can have even a cutie or an orange for that virtual hearing, and things start to get tough. You feel those reactions setting in, just punch your thumb into that cutie. It'll be fun because probably nobody has ever given you permission to punch your thumb into a cutie before. It'll feel good from a tactile level. And then as soon as that scent of the orange wafts up, that will re-energize your brain and pull you back from that fight or flight state or slipping into that, back into that fully integrated brain state. There's actually really cool research behind this. Brains linked up to PET scans where it has shown a distressed brain where the only parts that are firing are that brainstem portion, maybe a little bit of the limbic system, those fight or flight responses, and then they administer the scent of orange, and then all of a sudden, all those executive functioning, that logical thinking, reasoning, speech lights back up top. So that is definitely something that you can use in the moment. Likewise, and if you can see my hands up on the screen, right? I have them folded over. If you, under the table, offline of the computer, if you can simply find a nice, gentle pattern back and forth like this. What this is doing, and many of you actually might be familiar with the term EMDR, more so than many attorneys because of the client population you're working with, but EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And this is a proven strategy for calming down the brain, calming down the senses when anxiety creeps up, when we become overwhelmed, when we're at risk for falling into that fight or flight response, because it's a bilateral motion that is simultaneously bouncing back and forth between both sides of our brains. And this is a proven measure for calming down in the moment. And it's also a strategy for trauma treatment. So if you're in the moment, you're on a particularly frustrating hearing, you're feeling that through your own body cues, those red flags creeping up. For me, if it's not the heartburn, it's the locked jaw, that clenched jaw and grinding that kicks on. Just start to do that under the table. Nobody has to know what's going on screen, and that will help you get back into that integrated state. Finally, the last intervention for this is simply a deep breath. And this works for us because we are parasympathetic microorganisms. This works for others too. This can work with clients. I use this technique on the phone, in person, over video conferences. It works with kids really well too. Likewise, likely when I had that deep breath and you heard it, whether you saw me or not, many of you also took a deep breath, whether you meant to consciously or not. When we engage in deep belly breaths rather than shallow chest breaths that are associated with that fight or flight response, when we allow that breath to come all the way down in our belly, fill up our belly, and then slowly release, where our out breath is 2 to 3 times longer than our in breath. That naturally pulls us out of that fight or flight response, out of our limbic system, and back into that fully integrated brain state. Works for us, it works for our clients, it works for our kids. So again, another immediate exercise you can deploy. And if that interests you, yoga, mindfulness, meditation, all wonderful proven strategies of exercising that brain, just like a bicep, to where you do it for 30 days, 60 days, a couple of years, it gets easier and easier and easier to build in that resiliency, to pad yourself from the harmful impacts of this field and the chronic state of stress, and stay in that integrated whole well state where you can enjoy your life, you can enjoy your relationships, and enjoy your career. And so with that, again, I'm going to leave you with that challenge. Think about your areas where you're at risk. Think about ways your body might be sharing those red flags with you, and start to think about what you can do to build in those resiliency factors. What real life relationships can you pair with all of that environmental stimuli coming in that you don't have control over, so you have that balanced perspective and it's not your fight or flight response that's dictating your world and your view of others. And with that, I'll turn it to questions.
Anybody have questions for Amy? That was really, really helpful, Amy. I suspect we're all going to run to Safeway and get another bag of cuties right now.
Cuties and a plant.
Yeah. The deep breath thing, I had always heard that stimulates the vagus nerve. Is that true, or was that a myth? That
is true. Absolutely. If you research, Stephen Porges really is credited a lot with discovering the vagus nerve. The polyvagal theory is a wonderful book if you want to dig into that more. But that's exactly what it does. It pulls us out of our limbic system, our emotional hub, back into our executive functioning through those deep belly breaths.
I suspect a lot of us are right now operating at the level of the reptilian brain, just partially because not only are we dealing with extra stress amongst ourselves, our families, and our clients, coworkers, etc., but every bit of news that we see is all about the suffering going on around us. We're getting nonstop inundation of how many cases there are this week, how many deaths, etc. So this has been really, really helpful for me personally, and I suspect for everybody. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I don't see any questions on the chat. If anybody has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. If not, please run out. Like Amy said, get yourself a house plant, get yourself a puppy, get yourself a bag of cuties. And I think, I hope to see many of you tomorrow at the Boulder County Bar virtual musical bingo tomorrow. And I hope that if you all have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Amy. COLAP is really a wonderful gift for those of us who practice law here in Colorado. It's really, I think, a huge help to our community, especially a few years ago when I was the president of the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar. We had a huge wave of criminal defense lawyers who were committing suicide by cop, several of them. A lot of trauma that was unresolved and untreated, and we're now starting to see the damage that secondary trauma and primary trauma can do to us as professionals. So it's really wonderful that we have Amy and COLAP to give us the benefit of their expertise, and it is completely confidential if anyone wants to reach out to them. So thank you again, Amy. I really appreciate that, and hope to see everyone soon. This is the Criminal Defense Bar's the Boulder County Bar Criminal Law Section's last CLE of the year. We will be having more next year. Please feel free to email me or Kyle if you have suggestions of CLEs you'd like to hear. And again, COLAP's a wonderful organization. I strongly recommend that people read the materials that Amy has shared, that Kyle sent out. If you don't need assistance, maybe you have a friend who does, maybe you can participate, volunteer with COLAP. I just want to say thanks for everybody being here and have a wonderful holiday season. And thank you so much, Amy. Really wonderful.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.